welcome to the Womxn Show. I'm Lenina Rassool. Tonight we're doing things a little bit differently. We know that there is a war on women, that we have a crisis with rape, sexual assault, abuse and femicide across South Africa. But the knock-on effect of that is that we have hundreds, if not thousands, of survivors who have been through this, many of them not having found justice. And so tonight we aim to break the silence with a panel of survivors who are here to unpack and discuss their trauma and their journey toward healing. Let's have a quick look at the ladies who will be joining us after the break.
So this is my voice, Glowfly Dance, which is a book I've written, and my name is Jade Gibson, and I speak from the perspective of strength, because a lot of people look at stories that they call traumatic and they think of people as lesser beings, but this is the story of my childhood. It's about resilience, growing up with a family undergoing domestic abuse.
I'm Lynn Hill. I have not only survived multiple sexual trauma, I have used my pain, I've used the purpose in my pain to really step into the fullness of my authentic power. I am now a US published author. I am an inspirational speaker, globally recognized one, a poet, as well as a counselor and transformation practitioner.
I'm Lisa Adams. I've been a victim of sexual abuse from the ages of 8 to 16. I've recently curated my own form of gender-based violence protest with the Nene case, which took the form of a photographic expression for women to name their abuses. It's called Say His Name, and I'm currently writing a manuscript for a book called Broken Vagina that really just collects my experiences as a woman and how my vagina has sort of dictated a lot of who I am and what I've been through.
And I'm Lenina Rassool. I was sexually assaulted at 14 years old when a man broke into my home. After the break, we're going to be sitting down and discussing what it means to be a victim, what it means to be a survivor. We'll be back after this. Welcome back. You're watching the Womxn Show, and as you've heard, we're doing something different this evening. We are having a survivor roundtable, and in case you missed it, joining me this evening on our panel is Jade Gibson, who is the author of Glowfly Dance. We've got Lisa Adams, who's done some art activism and art protest against gender-based violence, and we have Lynn Hill, who is also an author and a speaker, and all of us are survivors. Welcome, ladies, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to jump in with a sort of question on terminology. So a lot of what's in the narrative around GBV right now is the contention around whether to call them survivors versus victims, and there's both for and against arguments. And as having been victims and as survivors, I just wanted to get your take on some of that. And also, how important is it, sort of these labels that are assigned to people who have been through these traumatic experiences? And Lynn, maybe I can start with you.
Why possibly would you start with me? I think our attachment, it's not so much the label as it is our attachment to a label. And for very many years, I considered myself to be a victim, and I would introduce myself as a victim of rape. And I think as I healed, victim became survivor, and I realized, because somehow I also did not want to be referenced as a victim, because that referencing was really a subtle implication that whenever I introduced myself as a victim of sexual trauma, I was really introducing the rapist as well. And that was just my sense, my feeling. And then survivor settled, and then I evolutionized a little more and healed a little more. And right now for me is I don't want to live my life just thinking that I have survived something. I want to be recognized as a thriver.
I think that's very interesting. I often think that sometimes I feel like a victim, and sometimes I feel like a survivor, and that there isn't sort of just one label that you can paste onto it. Lisa, what's your experience?
I think for me, I've been doing a lot of work and introspection around narrative, personal narrative for sexual assault, and I feel currently stuck in between all of that. I find that when I identify myself, I don't like it to be a focal point for what my identity is. But I do find that there is definitely strength and weight in the word victim. Currently, where I am at in my own process and opening up my own charges, I find that it is an appropriate weight because I still feel victimized. Even though my trauma is done, it's over with, I'm victimized by the system, I'm victimized, by society. And so I've been really struggling with that sort of, waiting on words and how people perceive that. I don't feel that I'm at a space, at the stage of calling myself survivor yet. I almost reject that celebration just yet because I'm still quite pained by what happened. So yeah, it's complex.
Thank you, Jade. With you, I think it's actually a little bit more interesting because your mother was murdered. And you've said in a previous interview that often in cases of intimate partner violence, we don't think about the children that much. And I'm thinking we don't think of the children as the victims often. And so what is sort of society's responsibility to you, and what are those labels?
Well, obviously there's the labels that society has, and then there's the labels that, or maybe the definitions that one chooses for oneself. So I also see myself as a thriver in many ways. But I'll start with, I'm a person. I've been through stuff, but I'm a person first and foremost, like anyone else. Yeah. And I'm no less whole or less human than anybody else. And that's what I start from. And but when you say, when talking about these things, yes, I'm a witness as well, but I'm also, in that we forget that children in situations of domestic violence are also subject to that violence, whether it's emotional, physical, or sexual. So you get caught up as well in that. And I think we just often think it's only the woman, but it's usually the children implicated as well. So when I've had to talk on panels, sometimes I'm put on these trauma panels, and part of me really resists that because I think that's not all I am. We box people, we put them into this label position or trauma place, and actually we forget they're a whole person. It can happen to anybody, it really can, and it just happened to be me. It's that sort of thing, and there's a lot of lack of responsibility that society takes, I think, in their own complicity in these things happening. So I think the whole of society is also a victim. If it affects us, it affects everybody. And as long as it carries on, we are still victims in a sense as society is. But first and foremost, we should strive for our own humanity.
Thank you. The next question wants to look at, and you're bringing in, speaking about sort of childhood experiences. And I know, Jade, with yourself and with Lisa, there was prolonged exposure to violence. And so I just wanted to chat about that as children and that process of processing violence at that age. Because we don't often speak about it. We just often touch the surface that these things happened. And when we're speaking about
15 years or 8 years, or it still sounds like a single event. But how for you, what was the process of experiencing that violence so young and having your young mind process it, and also then having that happen when you were 15, also still a child?
Yeah. I think for me, it was very, I think now reflecting on that, it's been quite interesting. As an 8-year-old, I sort of had this like coping mechanism that kicked in very quickly, a response to reasoning with what was happening. And I remember that my first reasonings were that, this probably happens to other girls. I knew immediately that we didn't speak about it. My perpetrator, sort of manipulated the situation so that there were no words uttered. So I think that set the foundation for the silence. And it also sort of drives you a little bit crazy. For 8 years, no spoken words during each event. You start to wonder, did it happen? Did I dream that happened? It doesn't, it gives it, the spoken word I think gives it a physicality. Besides the fact that it's sort of a contradiction because it is a physicality, right? But the connection with somebody actually speaking to you, I think that was a technique that my perpetrator used to keep me in silence. And I went on to sort of immediately think, I don't want to cause trouble. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know what the act actually was as it was happening. It was foreign to me. And it's a strange experience, I think, for a woman because your body reacts to what is happening. But your mind is sort of decapitated from the experience. And so your body is saying that this, it feels good. And your mind is saying what is happening. And so I went into that silence out of fear, I think also just so that, how do you break this to the people around you? How do you tell your family, this is a family member? How do I say this? This is a good person in society. This is someone who's supporting me, who is acting in a parenting figure. But silence was what was set up from the get-go, and I stuck to it. And in my mind, I started, as time went on, you start reasoning with it some more, and you become a teenager, and then things change, and your body changes, and you start to understand exactly what has happened, and you start to feel like damaged goods. Then it's shame and embarrassment, and you don't want to talk about it. And having boyfriends at that age was difficult. Where you try to sort of preserve your innocence in your relationships, but in the background, back at home, that was just being taken advantage of. And so just the silence just deepens on that level until you just eventually tell yourself, just keep going, keep running, you're going to reach the end. As soon as you are an adult, you're going to get out of this and you're never going to have to look back. So I think it's a strong conditioning. And it's definitely one that I've had to be very conscious of in my adulthood post-trauma. I find that I can do that very easily. I cope in chaos. Chaos is safety, and so I have to constantly remind myself to use my voice. I think as an adult, even with the protest art that I've been doing now, it's almost like I've had sort of verbal diarrhea about everything. I've been silenced for 8 years, and now it's just coming out really strong. And I think applying that sort of in every facet of your life is, a sexual assault happens in an incident, but people don't understand how it becomes the fundamentals for other things in your life. So I start applying those things to different relationships and being conscious of it and making sure that I'm not doing it and repeating the same sort of behaviors and tolerating bad behavior. That's sort of what the silence taught me as a kid.
Thank you, Lisa. That was very profound. I mean, and I think makes sense on so many levels. Jade, with domestic violence, there's both different dynamics and similar dynamics. There's definitely also silence. In my experience, it's been that again, no one speaks to the children, so there's never any context for domestic violence, and so you slip between chaos and normality, right? So everything's fine. Often, if parents will fight in the next morning, you'll still wake up for breakfast, and no one will tell you what happened or whether it's resolved. You just kind of go back to normal. Tell us about how you processed it as a young child, being witness to that.
It's interesting because there's different layers, So on the one level, there's an incredible awareness of silence, and this was from 5 years on that my stepfather was on the scene, and children know what's going on. They're always aware, and they may not be able to articulate or even think they can. The silences are in school and outside the home, because you're frightened if you do tell someone what will be the repercussions at home from the person perpetrating this. The silence is to watch a mother struggle with trying to be believed by people, and to see this going on, and people believing the man because he's got status and articulate and convincing and charming. And so that's there. In our home, there was a constant tension all the time, because there was emotional abuse as well that was ongoing all the way through, as well as physical. And then on top of this, as a child, my stepfather also was at one point attempting to groom me towards sexual abuse, and my mother found out, fortunately, before it got too far. But you were talking about this innocence of children in a way that you don't know what's going on. So my mother said, "Has he been doing other strange things?" Yeah. And I said, "Yes, he makes me dry my toothbrush," which for me was a really strange thing. But all the other things, like climbing naked into my bed, was not considered strange by me because he didn't hurt me. And so I think, and often I think, as I've written in Glowfly Dance, I've just told the child's story as the child sees it, because I want parents to actually think about, children don't understand sexual things, so they're not able to also to articulate this is wrong, because they don't know it's wrong. They just know, in my case, I'm not getting hurt, so it's okay. At least he's being nice, So there is also that need to have a voice. I mean, Glowfly Dance was my voice. And I say that because I also felt you can't just, you see these headlines and it's this big horror story, somebody was killed, but what about all the stuff that led up to it, and all the people who didn't do anything, and the lack of support and the lack of institutions? So that there's a sort of anger in me about society not doing things. We lived in a refuge, but was my mother really protected? No, So I think there's all of that. And in my working life, I spoke to close friends, but I never told the story of Glowfly Dance until I wrote it. And it was petrifying to actually step up and speak about it as well.
Lynn, for you, our stories are a little bit similar in that I was also a teenager, and it was sort of the trauma was once off. And I noticed it was, with me, they never found the perpetrator. They never, and the story disappeared. So we put it in a box and we just didn't talk about it because it was really just too uncomfortable. And so I can relate very much with Lisa's analogy of verbal diarrhea. That's sort of, once you say it, it happened. Because it's like it didn't happen. But for you, your perpetrator was someone known to you. He was caught.
He wasn't quite known to me. He was a church member.
Yes, yes. But he was caught, and then there was the court case, and there had to be narrative around that. How did you process in that?
I could not. My 15-year-old brain could not process the level of brutality. So, because it was, it felt like a nightmare while it was happening, except that I knew it wasn't, and that it was real because I was experiencing my pain in the way that I did. And it was brutal. I tasted my blood, I smelt my blood, I was drowning in my blood. And beyond that, so I literally, physically felt demolished. I felt annihilated. And I was incapable of, I remember waking up out of 72 hours of sedation and feeling my face, and just every bit of my body did not feel like it belonged to me. So the swelling had totally set in. And I remembered, because I could not see, my eyes had been beaten shut. And I remember feeling my way from my bed to the mirror, and then actually forcing my eyes open because I needed to see what I looked like. And Lisa spoke earlier of a coping mechanism that kicks in, and you just know. And that was my moment of detaching. So the horror mask that looked at me was the mask that I told myself is not part of my movie. It's not part of my nightmare. And that was my first moment of, it was almost my sanity. It was the detaching. And with that detachment, obviously, came the repression, burying it in what I call, in one of my articles, was the graveyard of my soul. And so I buried for many, many years. Yes, it had to come. I lived through it in court. And I lived through it when writing the book again. And I've lived through it with SABC1. So the level of detail that was required, I needed to live through. But in terms of the processing, I don't think any 15-year-old, I don't think any child, we weren't wired to process this level and the depth of violation, and so you are just incapable. And even through therapy, I think the processing really happens and the healing happens not in childhood itself, but it happens as an adult. Yeah.
Thank you, Lynn. We need to take a short break, but we'll be back after this. Welcome back. You're watching the Womxn Show, and today we're having a Survivor Roundtable. And ladies, I want to come back into the conversation just with a clip from Lynn's previous show that we had, where she talks about the response from police officers referring to her rape as a real rape. And let's just have a look at that quickly.
In that process, my parents were called, and I'll never forget, in fact, preparing for the show, the one thing that I didn't put in my book that just came through while in prep mode for the show was walking into the police station, the one police saying, "My God, was she in a train accident?" And the other one looking at him and looking at me with tears in his eyes saying, "This is a real rape."
So, ladies, I mean, that clip is going to take us into our next question, because we've spoken about sort of it feeling like a nightmare, and the responses from other people about how our trauma is perceived. And Jade, you spoke specifically about women not being believed. So, as survivors, do we think, from my experience and also from other stories, because once you speak up, you hear other people's stories, that there is this overemphasis on sort of judging how bad the trauma is based on how bad the physical injuries are. And I just want to unpack a little bit societies and, the legal sectors, the justice system's responses to our experiences based on that, whether that came through for you.
For me, despite the level, so while it was considered a real rape by the policeman, the level of brutality never had society judge me less. I was judged all the same. And it was almost like, as much as the brutality made it a valid experience of violation, it was almost like that was not enough a price to pay for me. And that was cheap. Society's judgment was cheap.
What were, I just want to hear, what were some of the
narrative? The narrative was, she's easy. She was always easy, and yet I was untouched when he touched me. I'd had one kiss to my name. I was damaged goods. I was not seen as a virgin. I was not seen for the violation. I was seen as a product of something that I could control, and yet it was just so horribly misperceived. And this is why I feel so strongly about the demystification of rape.
Yeah.
What does it really mean, and violation and molestation? Are there levels of it, or is it just what it is?
And so that's important, because that's actually also one of the things that makes it very difficult to speak about rape, is because even if it's acknowledged as rape or sexual assault, women are still judged. You're not a virgin anymore. I mean, it just is. There's so much weight attached to virginity and women's sexuality.
Absolutely. Also, this demystification around healing. I, for example, got told by a pretty significant other, why is it that you're not over it yet? And so this whole thing of it has happened, and so can you just move on with your life, please? And yet again, that just illustrates that the depth of violation is really not understood.
It's interesting that you say that. I've always felt really disheartened by the terminology and the language used around this. In my circumstance, the morning after it had come out about what had happened, went immediately to the police station and opened up a case. And the next sort of protocol was to go for a medical examination. And I remember sitting there thinking, what are you going to find? This has been going on for 8 years. You're not going to find 8 years worth of damage. I'm a grown teenager, almost adult woman. And I remember laying on that cold metal bench or bed. Male doctor in the room, a male investigator in the room, my mother, and there was another male present in the room. And they made me, take off my clothes, and they were now going to interrogate my vagina at that point. And I was laying there thinking, wow, if only it was just a little bit more brutal, maybe you would have taken this more seriously. I knew that they were not going to find any evidence of semen from that night, but all the other occasions that happened previously had just disappeared in that moment. And I didn't feel like I was taken too seriously about what had happened. The terminology that was being used around me was sort of indecent assault. I remember that's what they called it. And I remember in my mind thinking this was penetrative, this was rape. And it wasn't brutal enough at that time. It wasn't, as you say, a real rape at that moment. And I couldn't comprehend what they were trying to look for, because they were not going to find it. It was hidden so deeply in my vagina in parts that they couldn't find it. That process was in my mind. Yeah.
Yeah. I feel that I'm just listening to you talking, and I'm thinking about my own experiences of talking, and we talk so much about, and I think in the press we focus on this the victim label and the experience, but what about the perpetrators? Why are we not talking about their damage, their problems, their virginity or lack of it, and how could this person be so heinous and do such terrible things? Everything's in media often focuses on that, almost, I think, re-brutalizing the woman in that physical experience that you're put through again. And this presence of men. So even at 14, I had to one case, and I've written about it in my book, is that talked to police about my experience when I was 9 years old, because my younger sister was at risk. And I had to they made me give a witness statement. And afterwards, and it was to men, and afterwards I was left with these two men as my mother had to go and speak to someone else. And then they said, there's something wrong with her. And imagine, you're a child, and this is what you're hearing. And this is a further brutalization. So why do our so-called systems of support, the doctors, the police, why are they re-brutalizing the person who grows through this? And I think the media must be very conscious. Are you re-traumatizing by, in the way you deal with this, or are you actually celebrating this person's humanity and wholeness and generosity in telling the story?
And I actually think it really comes back to patriarchy. It comes back to how historically women have been perceived or misperceived, and the whole power dynamic between being a male versus being a female. And it's unfair. And yet, if one looks at it, then that deflection, that not focusing on the perpetrator, on the violator, that deflection really is a perpetuating mechanism for patriarchy to continue.
And not only that also the focus on the victim is leave him, is what people get told in domestic violence. But does anyone say, if you leave him, he's just going to go on to the next person? And eventually someone's going to get very, very hurt,
And that, absolutely.
So you're continuing.
Also, I like to speak from a place of my identity as a colored woman, and in the colored society that I grew up in. I think that there's a major responsibility for the people around us in the community that I grew up in, because they were so tolerant of violence and abuse. It was normalized. You knew that violent things were happening in your neighbor's home, in your own home, and like you said earlier, you wake up the next morning and life goes on. And I think that sets the foundation for the kids in those communities, because what is the point of bringing something up? It's either going to cause another fight, it's just not going to be dealt with and not going to be respected in the same way. Someone actually told me recently, a family member, that they never really understood what had happened to me, and they kind of tolerated my perpetrator, As soon as everybody found out about what had happened, people were angry, but the anger settled very quickly. And this person stayed around, and they were invited to family events. And the kind of the narrative I got from these people is that, I thought it only happened once. It wasn't that big of a deal. And it disturbs me, because even if this thing had only happened one time, why did you not ostracize this person from our spaces? I always felt like my perpetrator was more valued than I was, because he was the life of the party. And they'd much rather have the life of the party at the party than value my trauma and what I'd been through.
And so that's so important. I mean, I think because often I've also said we don't talk about the rapists.
Yeah.
We actually just don't. And yes, these stories are important, and we need to speak about it. But as we speak about it, what's interesting for me is the normalization of this violence. Almost it's like every second woman I meet since I've done the show will very generally sometimes and casually say, well, this happened to me when I was 3, or this happened to me by a teacher, or this happened to me by a family member, and it is normalized, actually.
I think absolutely normalized within the colored community. There was also just a silence about a lot of things. Apartheid silenced us. And we came from a scripting where it was better to eat humble pie than to speak your truth and to assert yourself. And and the moment you spoke your truth and it would disturb the status quo, you were silenced anyway. So there was, within the patriarchal system, there was an apartheid system, and there was it just added another layer of the mystification of power.
I do want to say, though, I mean, I have to say that in my work over the past 15 years, I found, and now ending up in gender-based violence, and I'm speaking about rape, and especially rape and sexual assault, and domestic violence, it is the one issue that cuts across class. I mean, there are layers to it, but it's the one issue. The silence is the same, the stories are the same, you can bring together. I've sat at tables where there are different demographics, classes, races, etc., and the reasons for the silence is the same. And what's often interesting to me, Lisa, you brought up justification. You specifically mentioned that as a young 8-year-old even. But what's interesting to me is, and especially we saw this in the US, I think, with the Nassau case, the Olympic gymnast doctor, and in those victim impact statements, if you listen to it, there were over 100 victims. The first thing that comes through is justification. It's almost like we can't believe that this is happening ourselves, and so one of the things is, oh, it must be happening to others also. No one else has spoken up. This is normal. This is okay.
So I think the normalization thing, I've been thinking a lot in terms of like my own circles and where does the change start? Like I've been very vocal on social media. I've created a campaign about this and everything. But I was like, I'm frustrated with the community around me. What do we do? And I actually had to go through this own personal process of, confronting it within my family and saying, we have been too tolerant. I've had to go through a process of forgiveness towards the people around me and say, you know what, I'm older now and I realize that we as a family, we just were not well equipped to deal with this matter. We never understood it. And now we need to change our narrative around that for the next generation of kids and not be as tolerant and speak out. And even me doing this kind of thing makes many people in my close circle feel very uncomfortable. Like there's something wrong with you.
Yes, exactly. So that's the other thing. And I think, Jade, I said to you, I started reading your book, and I understood why it was endorsed by the Department of Education, because almost it starts. I mean, the tolerance doesn't start. It shouldn't start with the rape, or I think it just happened once, right? That tolerance is starting, we know, very, very, very young, and tolerating domestic violence. And having a man beating his wife that night, and the next day, everybody's greeting them in the street or at the shops, or still going out to the beach together.
I think we're not connecting dots as well, and because of these categories and these, this is this and this is that, we segment everything. But I was actually thinking, it's interesting, we're all on this panel around gender violence, but we separate domestic violence from rape. And sexual abuse. But actually, and as an adult from the court notes, I know my mother was being regularly brutally raped by her own husband. So rape, and also the domestic violence in itself, violence perpetrated on a woman, and also the killing of her, is a sense of ownership of her body. And it is a sexual act as well. And I think that we separate these and think they're all separate. And actually we need to think about this is all tied up.
And it really is underpinned by the overarching principle is violation and dehumanization. And it could play out in different contexts, but the principle remains the same. We speak of we need to become less tolerant, but we're not focusing sufficiently on what it is that is the root cause of what we are tolerating. And the root cause of what we are tolerating is that manhood and power within the relationship
those, and within the family, the power dynamic, those are the things that needs to be demystified. We need to recalibrate character.
Yes.
We need to recalibrate manhood. We need to recalibrate the non-historical role of what it takes as a male and as a female, as equal counterparts in a relationship to build a family. And we need to teach boys that they can cry.
And on that, I just want to say, because I have a daughter, and I have 3 nephews who are the same age. But even before them, we have lots of boys in our family. And I have to say, what I found really interesting, at least you're talking, we mentioned vagina, but from the minute boys are born, there's an obsession with their penises. Right? It's fine for it to be out, the way they pee, the way they, we joke about things like it's getting hard and it's so funny, and they play with it and all of those things. And I say this, I've seen it everywhere. I have lots of friends who are actually the majority of friends who have boys. And yet with girls, I found myself not knowing what to do here. No one ever speaks about it. I did not know that babies could still get discharged as a result of the mother's hormones when she's born. I'm just saying, for me it was just an indication of how little we speak about women, and how from birth we are being socialized, and boys and their genitals are out there and normalized, and and it's just something that we need to sort of start thinking about.
Unconscious
Yeah.
socialization.
Yeah, and at the same time, I also think, as a child, it's very obvious, funny enough, if you're witnessing this and experiencing, thinking, okay, why are women being treated this way? Why does that man get away with that? Why is it that these men can do this and nobody seems to bat an eyelid? A woman is crying out for help and nobody's listening. And so a child can see what's wrong, and that's why I wrote my book, because it is, if a child can see it, why can't we see it?
Yeah.
So why are we not connecting those dots? And why? I really think we need to, like you say, switch our heads.
Absolutely.
And start questioning a lot. And I'm kind of
Because-
optimistic as well.
Those dots would lead us to some fundamental inconvenient truths that would need to be addressed rather than concealed. For as long as we are concealing and not connecting the dots and saying, a slight rape is better than a real rape, or we have these degrees of whether it's brutality or damage, and if we're not getting to what we need to get to, we're never going to change society.
Ladies, sorry, we need to take a short break. Be back after this.